And again, we are looking forward to this training today. I want to give a reminder to Chelsea to please go ahead and press record if you haven't already. And just let everyone know we are recording today's session and we will make it available at the conclusion of the session. Our practice for disability inclusion is to caption our videos before we actually post them. So we'll have this video ready for you as soon as possible. So we will go ahead and get started with our session today. Our learning objectives today are really to provide you with a basic overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Today, we're going to talk about the history of the ADA and civil rights legislation for individuals with disabilities. We are going to talk about, and just briefly, that one of the protected statuses under our EO statutes, along with race and color and things of that nature, is disability. And we're going to talk about the ADA Amendments Act, what that is and why it was needed. What about the eligibility under the ADA? And we'll give you a brief overview of Title I of the ADA and Title II. Lastly, we will conclude with our best practices for ADA compliance and disability inclusion, and we'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions. I do invite you to ask your questions and put them in the chat. And Chelsea's going to monitor the chat, and she has that permission to interrupt me to answer a juicy question that you may have as we go through the presentation. But again, I want to give you a warm welcome. My name is James Clinkscale. I am the state ADA coordinator, and my role is to provide and promote our disability inclusion initiatives for all of our agencies, boards, and commissions under the governor's authority. My position was created as a result of the executive order that Governor DeWine signed when he made Ohio a disability inclusion state and model employer of individuals with disabilities. I want to remind our audience to please mute yourself. We want to eliminate any background noises. And again, we look forward to your participation. You can ask your questions at any point of this presentation. Let's get started with the history of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Where did this legislation come from? Why was it needed? Who does it impact? And very importantly, how does it impact us? So you will hear me say ADA throughout this presentation instead of saying the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we all know that that is an acronym for the Americans with Disabilities Act. So here we go. History of the ADA. You see in this picture here, do you recognize any of these people? To the left, we have the President of the United States, President Lyndon Johnson, and then we have Martin Luther King Jr. Why is he in this picture? This is a picture of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 after the signing of it. And there's other individuals in this picture too that you may recognize. But I wanted to point out those two main characters here and point out something very important about the ADA. It's a progeny of the Civil Rights Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. These things that we'll discuss. So when we think about Martin Luther King Jr., we've been reminiscing of the Civil Rights Act, a powerful impact it had on our society and on our country and even other countries. Those rights that once felt are endemic to just being a human being. Well, he led an effort in the 1960s, and probably maybe one of his greatest impacts was the passing of this Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the ADA is related to this effort, and we'll talk about that. So the history of civil rights legislation for people with disabilities begins with those efforts. Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Act, civil disobedience, asserting that I should have rights that make me a citizen of this country, and I should not be discriminated against based on certain characteristics. This was followed by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which we'll talk about, and culminated the wonderful piece of legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, a powerful civil rights legislation that focused on people with disabilities. And then in 2008, Congress felt it was necessary to amend the Americans with the ADA of 1990. So we'll talk about why. Why was that needed? But when we look at this slide here, we can see it has a long legislative history to get us to where we are today. As we talked about that civil rights movement in the 1960s, what is more, I would say, less well known is the Civil Rights Act for people with disabilities. People with disabilities also engage in civil disobedience. In this picture here, you'll see people, they have their wheelchairs in front of a public bus. Now the bus can't move. Civil disobedience because at that time, they could not get on a bus if they had physical limitations. So you see a sign that says lifts, not lies. They call themselves, another lady called herself a freedom rider here. And even, let's say a person needed a service animal. Well, they weren't allowed on the buses at that time, generally speaking. So people with disabilities also were involved in protests. They organized demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. And they even formed their own groups made of people with disabilities, outreaching to a variety of types of disabilities, and formed their own protest because they felt like they needed rights, even something as simple as public transportation. I really like this picture. It's a nice illustration here of the disability rights movement. Now, we probably all know, we heard about Rosa Parks and how she was asked to sit in the back of the bus and she refused to do it. At that time, it was a practice that African Americans, brown people, had to sit in the back of the bus because of the color of their skin. I think this is a really nice illustration from the disability rights movement, where if you look at the sign here, the person with a physical disability says, I can't even get to the back of the bus. No access. Public transportation simply was not built for people with physical impairments. There was nothing to allow them to get on that bus, with the exception of carrying someone on. And even then, where would they sit? So what was the problem nationwide when it came to access for ones with disabilities? And the important part to remember is that they fought for their rights. It was a movement, and they copied the civil rights movement of the 1960s. They did some things that helped pass legislation. We're going to talk a little bit shortly about the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, but that act was vetoed 2 times by then President Nixon. But because of these efforts, it was eventually passed and signed by the president in 1973. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But a wonderful result of this legislative history is that when it comes to EO protected groups, disability is included. So we can see that is a list that is not limited to just race and color, but really the civil rights movement defined civil rights for all of us in many different ways, but because we fit in one of these categories, more than likely. And so again, it's civil rights for all of us, and it includes disability. What an accomplishment there. Now let's talk a little bit more about this Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So the Rehabilitation Act has different sections, but a particular interest for us is Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. Did you know that this was actually the first disability civil rights law to be enacted in the United States? So this precedes the ADA. In 1973, the act prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in programs that receive federal financial assistance. This legislation set the stage for the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. But of particular interest to keep in mind, did you know that since this act was passed, that state agencies were required to be in compliance with Section 504? If we receive any federal financial aid, we have to be in compliance with this Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Let's talk about the ADA that came about in the 1990s. It was decided that, yeah, we have this protected status. So we've come a long way. We have this Section 504. But if you notice what I talked about before, Section 504 only applied to entities that receive federal financial aid. If you didn't receive federal financial aid and you were a private institution, well, the ADA did not apply. I mean, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act did not apply. So they felt like we need to expand coverage for people with disabilities. It's just not enough to have this Section 504 and limit it just to entities that receive federal financial aid. So the ADA was born out of that sentiment. And the ADA consists of 5 different titles. Title I governs the employment process. And we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. Title II is public services. And I like to call Title II the part of this legislation that really impacts us, state agencies and local government entities. So we fall into that category under Title II. Title III is public accommodations, and that really refers basically to the private institutions and employers. Title IV is telecommunications, and Title V is miscellaneous, which basically means anything that's not covered under those other 4 titles is covered under Title V as governed by Title V. But for today's purposes, just want you to know that there are 5 titles of the ADA. We're going to talk about Title I, employment, which does impact us as a state agency. And we're going to talk about Title II, which impacts our public services, those services that we offer to the public. We have to make sure that they are accessible and that the delivery of those services, our policies and procedures and things of that nature are not intentionally or unintentionally discriminating against individuals with disabilities. So again, we'll talk about both of those titles, and so we can have a basic understanding of what's required of us. Before we dive into Title I and Title II, let's talk about why an ADA Amendments Act was even needed. So we had this fabulous legislation in 1990, the first comprehensive civil rights legislation that had a broad scope of coverage, happened in 1990, because it didn't matter if you received federal funding or not. It had just about everybody was covered and had to abide by that legislation. So what it did was it increased accessibility for people with disabilities and really sped up that process by having that ADA of 1990. But Congress said the ADA is great, but we're having some issues here. And so they amended the act. And they felt like they needed to amend it because of the way the term disability was defined under the 1990 statute. To just give you some basic illustrations on that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But the scope of protection for people with disabilities was kind of limited by the wording of the 1990 legislation. And as a result, people with disabilities sometimes were caught up in how we try to determine if something happened rather than trying to accommodate people, which Congress said, no, we want people to be accommodated. I don't want to get hung up on things like mitigating measures, episodic conditions, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Those things were prohibiting people with disabilities from potentially getting the accommodations that they needed. So Congress took it upon themselves and said, we're going to amend this act. It was passed in 2008, and they directed the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, we call the EEOC, to amend its ADA regulations to reflect those changes made by the ADAA. So I'm just going to say ADA Amendments Act instead of saying all those A's. But now this is the current law that we look at when we think about protections for people and individuals with disabilities under this act. So let's talk about disability and eligibility as defined by the ADA. What does that mean? And it's important to understand something. I'm going to show you the definition of disability in a moment under this statute. So if you're listening to this and saying, well, that's not what I think disability means, and you might even be correct if you're looking for a medical definition, this is how it's defined under the ADA. And so as the state ADA coordinator, I may issue things, and I'm going by this definition as well. Not a medical definition, but how it's defined by the ADA. So in order to be someone who is an individual with a disability under the ADA, a person has to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Now I'm going to talk about what major life activities are and also major bodily functions in a moment. But let's just focus on a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits. Keep that in mind because we will talk about, again, shortly, what major life activities are. So in the regulations, this sometimes is referred to as an actual disability. So the ADA says that we have a three-pronged way of defining disability or making a person eligible. So if a person meets this prong one, they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, they're eligible under the ADA just based on that one prong. They only have to meet one prong of eligibility, not all of these. Another way a person could be eligible as a person with a disability under this act is if they have a record of a physical or mental impairment. So in other words, give you a really easy definition for that. Say a person was attending high school and even earlier in their educational process, and maybe they receive some assistance or accommodations in school. They have a record of a physical or mental impairment. Or even if they weren't receiving accommodations in school, but they have a record of having some type of physical or mental impairment. That substantially, again, limits a major life activity. Just them having that record of it would make them eligible under this prong of the ADA. So again, you only have to be eligible under one prong to be eligible for ADA protection. The third prong is a little bit different. This one is called regarded as, and this causes a lot of confusion. So we'll try to clean up what that confusion could potentially be. But this is when an employer takes an action prohibited by the ADA. And they take this action because it's an actual or perceived impairment that is not both transitory and minor. So what does that mean in plain English? Employer thinks an employee has a disability. They have done nothing to try to find out, is that true or not? And then they take some type of action that is prohibited by the ADA. So I'll give you a real easy example. And this is based on a true life situation. There was an employee that management thought had some kind of mental health disability. Other of their coworkers would complain about this employee. Management moved that employee to a different part of the office, and they were somewhat isolated because they thought that they were disruptive, and they thought it may have been related to their mental health impairment. This employee had no mental health impairment. They had no record of it. And, to their knowledge, they did not have a physical or mental impairment at all. But that action was taken. And so therefore, they filed a complaint. Under the ADA, we can regard someone as, even when they don't have a disability. That is a bad practice to do. So management and employees, we should never do that to an employee, regard them as having a disability. We'll talk a little bit about going through a process to determine eligibility later in the presentation, but we should limit eligibility from a management and from a human resource perspective to only those first two prongs. They either provide us with substantiation under the first prong, or they already have a record of it under the second prong. A little bit more about regarded as, because this is one that when I train private employers on this, they really want to dig into this. So we'll dig into it just a little. To be eligible, only thing the person has to do is show that they have been subjected to an action prohibited under the statute. For instance, termination, failure to hire. These are just examples. It could be other examples of as well, but because of an actual perceived impairment. That's the regarded as part. Now, because of that, we have said, whether we meant to or not, that they are an individual with a disability. And now they're entitled to the protections of the ADA and or the Rehabilitation Act that we talked about before, Section 504. So here's a person who does not have a disability necessarily, but they are protected under the statute because they've been regarded as having one. Now, whether unlawful discrimination occurred is a separate determination, but because of that, because we've done this, from a management or human resources perspective, it has to be viewed by the management or the agency, not just coworkers. That would not reach the level of regarded as, because management could just tell coworkers this, we don't do that, and probably have policies against treating other employees unfairly. So again, a person can assert their rights of protection under the ADA, but did discrimination occur? That would be something that would be handled through the complaint process. So a huge question I always get, does that mean if someone's regarded as, so we have to accommodate them if they ask for an accommodations? No, an employer need not provide a reasonable accommodation to an individual who meets only the regarded as prong of the definition of disability. So in other words, once you find out you were wrong, I'm just going to be quite frank, we regarded them as they really don't have one. We do not have to provide a reasonable accommodation because they're not eligible for it. You have to be a person with an actual disability to be accommodated. However, they are protected from discrimination and protected from discrimination or discriminatory actions based on that being perceived or regarded as having a disability. So let's talk about major life activities. Remember, we said it has to substantially limit a major life activity. Here are major life activities, and this is not an all-inclusive list. If you are a person that has some type of disability or limitation, sometimes people are surprised at looking at a list like this and saying, oh, I am a person with a disability under the ADA. Well, you very well might be if you have some kind of condition that impacts seeing, for instance, hearing, learning, reading, breathing. How about sleeping? All of those things could potentially be something that would qualify you under ADA. And sometimes people are like sleeping. Yes, things like sleep apnea could make a person eligible for ADA consideration. Learning difficulties, even things like caring for self, like So that surprises people sometimes too. Some people like irritable bowel syndrome. That could potentially be something that impacts a major life activity. And the person may request a reasonable accommodation based on that. And we would have to go through our process to see if we can accommodate that individual. So these are examples of major life activities. Again, it's not an all-inclusive list. If you're a member of management or an agency and you ever get stuck into something that's unusual, we invite you to reach out to the disability inclusion team, and we will help you with that to see if it's potentially a major life activity that may not be listed here. It is important to know that the ADA also considers major bodily functions as major life activities. So in other words, they obviously they're separate. They're two different definitions of what they are. But the consideration of eligibility or that limitation, they look at the major bodily functions just the same way they will look at major life activities. So what are some examples of those? A person could have some immune system issues. It's a big thing under COVID right now. That could be a major bodily function. Sometimes there's some confusion over what would make a person eligible under that act. It does depend on what the medical information says, but just a person who may have some immune system limitations could make them eligible under the ADA. And it could be neurological, circulatory, etc. But these are the type of things or limitations, impacts that could make someone eligible for ADA consideration. So major life activities or major bodily functions. So we also want to make sure we provide a definition of ADA eligibility. So the person must have a disability, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Those other prongs that we talked about as well would make someone eligible under this statute, particularly when we're talking about the employment part of those protections. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit greater detail shortly. But from an employment perspective, you notice it said on the eligibility, it mentioned qualified. What does that mean? So the person with the disability must meet the ADA eligibility. So one of those three prongs of eligibility. And then they must meet all job related qualifications. So a person who cannot perform the essential functions of their job with or without a reasonable accommodation could be a person who is not qualified under the ADA. And that as long as we've made appropriate determinations of how we can accommodate them and then how they're able to perform those essential functions of their job. Again, we need to be correct about our analysis of qualified, but they need to meet all job related qualifications in order to be eligible under the ADA. So just to sum this up, who is ADA eligible? Any person that meets one of the three prongs of eligibility as defined by the ADA Amendments Act. They only need to qualify under one of those prongs. And then under Title I, it's an individual who meets ADA eligibility and meets all job-related qualifications. Sometimes employers want to know, well, if the person's not qualified for the position or they're not qualified to do this, their resume and their background don't really match up. Does that mean that we have to provide reasonable accommodation? So I think the answer is obvious. They have to meet all job-related qualifications. So it is important to note that ADA prohibits discrimination against employees or applicants who have a disability and requires employees to provide reasonable accommodations in the workplace. This is under those Title I protections. Remember, Title I covers employment. So we're going to dig into these Title I regulations for a moment. But I want to repeat, it prohibits discrimination against employees or applicants who have a disability and requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations in the workplace. It is not optional. to provide reasonable accommodation. We'll get into that later. If a person qualifies under those first two prongs, then they may be entitled to a reasonable accommodation to assist them in the workplace. So the Title I regulations do several things. One, it defines disability. We just talked about that. It establishes guidelines for the reasonable accommodation process. It addresses medical examinations and inquiries to self and others, and it defines what is meant by direct threat. And so we're going to talk about that too. We're going to talk about two things: undue hardship and direct threat. Just a quick note about medical examinations. We're not going to do a deep dive into that, but I do want you to know that there is another training available that we will send notice about soon on an overview of Title I. And so we'll talk a little bit more about medical examinations and inquiries in that training. This one, we want to just give you a basic overview of what Title I regulations help us to understand. So continuing with this, it prohibits employers from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities in the job application procedures, hiring and firing, advancement, compensation, job training, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. In other words, it covers the entire employment process from the moment that a person is trying to become employed, test or interview, onboarding, and when they are an employee. It covers all aspects of the employment process from the beginning part to, again, when they become an employee. During each one of those processes, we cannot discriminate against qualified individuals with disabilities. So if a person may reach out to us and say they need help with the job application, this, for example, could be through our hiring portal, which we host here at DAS. So to help with that, we have a notice on there that if a person needs help due to a disability to complete the application process, we let them know who they should contact, and we may indeed provide a reasonable accommodation to help them through that application process. It has happened before, and we endeavor to make sure that everybody has access to those beginning stages of our employment process. So I just wanted to provide an example. The other example I wanted to provide a couple more job training. So at times we may have an existing employee that may have a disability, and for other employees, we provide a variety of training. For that person with a disability, they may need an accommodation to participate in that training, even if it's an exterior training. We would need to make sure that if we're offering that type of training opportunity to other employees or this employee, that we assist them to obtain an accommodation or attain something very similar when it comes to the training that can be accommodated. Again, well, that is a subject, greater detail in our Title I overview. So other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment are also covered. For instance, even where we may eat lunch, that area would need to be accessible to individuals with disabilities because it is a privilege of employment. If we offer some type of break room to our employees, but we offer it in a manner that is not accessible to someone who has, let's say, a physical impairment, then we are not offering them the conditions and privileges of employment that we do for other employees. That could potentially be discriminatory, and we would need to make an effort to accommodate that person. Who must comply with Title I? It covers employers with 15 or more employees, including state and local governments. And this is something sometimes that ones don't know. It also applies to employment agencies and labor organizations. So if you're a person who's a member of a union or a union representative out there, it covers labor organizations as well. Give you an example. An employee with a disability was represented by their union. They filed a complaint or grievance under that union process, and they needed a sign language interpreter. Well, the union who was initiating this action did not know that the ADA applied to them as well. So that person needed to be able to be represented appropriately and have a sign language interpreter. That was resolved by the union and the employer working together. And in this particular case, they decided to split it 50-50 because of the nature of their labor process. But just to know that, I just like to note that because sometimes people don't know that it also covers labor organizations. Title II. Let's talk about that. This wouldn't be an ADA basics without making sure we knew about Title II. When we talked about Title I, those are your individual rights if you're an employee with a disability, if you're an applicant with a disability. Title I covers the entire employment process like we talked about before. Title II is different. Title II applies to state and local governments. It doesn't matter how many employees we have. All of us have to be in compliance with Title II. And Title II says no qualified individual with a disability, because they have a disability, should be excluded from participating in or be denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities that we provide. So when it comes to our Title II compliance, of course, it's going to be led by our agency leadership, but you might have a role. If you're not part of an agency leadership, you may have a role in ensuring that a service or program or activity that we offer is accessible to people with disabilities. This is one that I like to say is a comprehensive, this is a team effort to make sure that the public that we serve. Remember that sign, I can't even get on the back of the bus? We don't want anyone to feel that way when it comes to accessing to any service, program, or activity we have. That would include trainings that are open to the public, that would include meetings that are open to the public. We want them to have access, and we want to make sure they're not excluded in things that we offer. That could, again, it's that accessibility is going to be led by management, but you could have a role in ensuring that, because you could be part of a frontline staff where you're offering a program or service that your agency offers, and then someone with a disability says, hey, I need an accommodation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's important for us to know that this is a team approach when it comes to Title II compliance. It applies to all of us. It doesn't matter how big our agency is or how small. We must be, we cannot discriminate against individuals with disabilities. It covers every program and service and activity we have, including employment practices. Now, I want to spend a little time on the employment practices because sometimes I get like a little pushback from lawyers who say, well, you know, it's all over the place with the courts. If somebody files a complaint or a grievance under Title II about our employment practices, because that's really covered under Title I. Well, I would agree with that. That the rule, if somebody says there is this issue with our employment practices, we will look at the rules in Title I to address that. However, we never want the public not to be able to tell us that they have an access issue. If we receive that issue, we want to work through our process of interacting with that individual to see how we can make sure they have access. And so some of you may be aware that recently I sent out a memo that required our state agencies to have a disability inclusion poster that we post in different areas of the state. And one of those areas is physically where people can actually potentially see it. Because we want the public to know that we want our programs, activities, and services to be accessible. And if there's something they need, then we want to see if we can supply that for them. And this again is where you, if you're a frontline worker, somebody may ask you for that. And we want to make sure that you know what to say to them. We want to make sure you know the efforts that your agency has to be in compliance with this part of the ADA. So your agency very soon is going to provide a little clarification on some of the things they may want you to do if that happens. If somebody with a disability asks you for something, what should you do? It's important that you know that. And so we're working with agencies to make sure you have that kind of information. And I have to commend some of the agencies out there. You've already created trainings around this. It's pretty awesome. I'm excited that we're going to educate our staff because all of this is going to help us to be a disability inclusion state and a model employer. So when it comes to the employment practices, just last thing on this, you remember it said if you have 15 or less employees, then you're eligible. You have to be in compliance under Title I. I'm just going to tell you this. All of our state agencies, board, everybody under the governor's authority has to be in compliance with Title I. That is explicitly, I believe, implied by the executive order, but also, even if Title I didn't apply under what the rules say, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act would apply, which is essentially Title I. So we basically have to follow Title I when it comes to our employment practices. So yes, the legislation mentions in Title II, you can't discriminate against your employment practices. We might hear something from a member of the public that talks about, hey, I have an access issue. We just want to help them to see if we can overcome whatever that issue is. And yes, we would look at our Title I obligations in order to make that decision. We have to work together. Some of the initiatives that are coming out of the disability inclusion program is uniformity in a variety of our processes. That's why we have this disability inclusion access poster. We want to really present the same information to the public or very similar information to the public. We want the public to know that we're interested in them having access, and we want them to be included in the things that we do from day to day. They're an important part of the citizens that we serve. And I know that many of you that are here and in this training agree with that wholeheartedly. And I'm very happy. I've received such feedback from so many people who are excited and happy that we are really making a concerted effort to be a disability inclusion state and their model employer. So we're going to work together to make sure that we're compliant with the ADA, whether it's Title I or Title II. Accessibility is important to us, and that includes what we do from our cyber world or our IT world, our web pages and websites, documents and things that we create, and just that interaction that people have, maybe when a service or activity or program that we're hosting. And of course, it's very important to us for our existing employees with a disability that you feel comfortable, that you indeed can make a request for a reasonable accommodation, and that your agency will do a best effort to try to provide that for you in compliance with the law. You're included too. And you are what helps us to be a model employer. The fact that you're employed by the agency and the fact that you can get what you need to be successful as an employee of the agency that you work for. So we have the compliance with the ADA, and then we have the executive order 2019-03D that outline ADA compliance, the executive order, our disability inclusion efforts. Those together will help us to be the model employer that we desire to be. So we want to promote compliance and disability inclusion. How can we do that from an agency perspective? How can we be proactive doing those things? Now, I just want to add that we're going to have individual trainings on so many of these topics. I know that there are some of you, if you're ADA coordinator out there, some of you are, you are really advanced. And the conversations that I have with you is clear that that is the case. Some of us are beginners. We've just been recently told you're the ADA coordinator, and we have quite a bit to learn. And some of us are somewhere in between. Now, for me personally, I want to make sure all of us thrive and are successful, us ADA coordinators, EO officers, and then the human resource people that help to make these efforts a reality. We want to have a basic understanding, and for our ADA coordinators, we want you to have a very thorough understanding of ADA compliance and disability inclusion. Being proactive, we can review our RA process and practices for hidden barriers, bias, and uniformity. Now, in particular, do we have a policy that governs our ADA process? And if so, do our HR team and does our EEO officer and does our ADA coordinator understand those processes? Maybe we should meet, talk about it, and think about what we have. Is it cumbersome for people to access this? Are we communicating well with individuals who may make a request? These are some things that we can think about doing. Here's a huge one, and we're going to talk about this again in our best practice. Educate the employees. Please educate your employees and supervisors about RA requests and procedures, and if you have an ADA policy, how all that applies. We will in the future be requiring that everybody have an ADA policy. Some of you agencies already have one, but hopefully relatively soon, we'll be able to say all of us need to have one. We're even going to provide you with a template of how to have one. But for now, whatever your process is, make sure people are educated. And I include employees. I even put employees first because so many times, especially when I first took this role, multiple employees would contact me and say, are you the person I'm supposed to come to get a reasonable accommodation? They didn't know the name of their ADA coordinator. They had no idea that there was a policy or procedure that they should follow within their agency. And so I would have to do a little research and find out and get them connected to the right person. But we don't want our employees to have to do that. We want to have a clear process and procedures that they understand. Of course, we want to timely evaluate and respond to any request for reasonable accommodation, and that would include our existing employees and requests we might get under Title II. We want to quickly get back to people. Now, employees, if you're an employee out here, you're trying to learn a little bit more about the ADA, let me tell you something that you should expect from your employer. Sometimes people don't want to ask for a reasonable accommodation because of several reasons, but I'm just going to focus on this one. What are you going to do with this information, employer? What are you going to do? You're asking me for medical. What are you going to do? Are you going to, first of all, are you even going to accommodate me? And number two, are you going to blast me on Front Street and let everybody know my business when that is not my intent? I just need an accommodation to help me to do my job. In other words, the person wants privacy to a degree. What can you expect? Employers should maintain a separate and confidential file from your HR and performance files. They're not to be put together. That should never be a practice. Your files are confidential and they're not to be shared with other employees who do not have the right to know. We expect employers to create an open and psychologically safe space for discussions about an RA request with their employees. So we don't want to have a process that's antagonistic. We want to have a process that gives voice to the person asking, that listens to the person who's asking for a request, and that they can get their questions answered when they're making a request. And they understand the process involved in saying yes or no to their request. Those are very important things that you should expect from your employer. These are things that we train, and these are the things that I know many agencies are making sure that they're doing now. I would just say this too. I just want to add as I commend the agencies. From the time I started to where we are today, wow, you guys have really done such a good job with integrating disability inclusion initiatives. One of the most important things that we can do is accept differences. Yeah, I like to tell a story about a person, a young person. He had a physical impairment. He his legs were bent, and so when he walked, and this was something that was going to get worse and worse, he may need a wheelchair later in life. As growing up, he couldn't play with the other kids to a degree. He could to a degree, but some things he just couldn't do. And unfortunately, sometimes, kids can be cruel and make fun of people. So this young man, a little older in his teenage years, went to his mom and said, I'm so sick of being made fun of. They say I walk funny and they say I do all these things. And the mom took a moment and paused. And she said to her son, you know how much I love you. And you do walk differently. Some people would say you even walk funny. But let me tell you about all the things that you do exceptionally well. And she built him up. So long story short, this young man is a college graduate, has an excellent job, and has a good mental disposition. And I share that story for one reason. We want to accept people's differences. So what? A person may look different, maybe utilize a tool differently, or need some kind of accommodation. We just need to help them to do the things they do excellently. And if we take that approach, when we are interacting with employees, it'll go very smoothly. So let's talk a little bit about the reasonable accommodation process. What is a reasonable accommodation? Is any change or adjustment to a job, the work environment, or the way things usually are done that would allow a person to perform the essential functions. Or, remember we mentioned before, enjoy equal access to the benefits available to others in the workplace. So it's two things. We got to look at the essential functions. Sometimes they could be mentioning something that's an equal benefit. They feel is not available to them or it's not accessible, etc. We may have to accommodate that. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations to allow that qualified person with a disability to perform the essential functions of their position. So it's not optional. Sometimes when people reach out to me and they want to know, well, is this process okay? And any of you out there who have talked to me know that I always want and I always remind you the expectation of the disability inclusion program is that you will accommodate that person unless there's an undue hardship, which we'll talk about in a moment, because we're required to do it. If they're qualified, if it's reasonable. Now, there are instances where maybe the request is not reasonable and employers in that case don't have to provide. But generally speaking, a person asks for a request for reasonable accommodation. The expectation is that if they're qualified and if it helps them to do the essential functions of their position, we want to see them accommodated. And we want that process to take place where employees feel like I can be reasonably accommodated. And I am going to use the word reasonably because I have to also say that if it's not a reasonable request, an employer is not required to do it. What's the goal here? You see on the left, we have equality, we see equity. Now, this is a big thing on the left, especially when they training some private employers and sometimes even within our state agencies, where equality, people want to say our policies are neutral. They apply to everybody. It's equal. But when we look at this on the left, there's a picture of a person who's tall, someone who's not as tall, and then someone of a shorter stature. And they're all sitting on a box. The box is exactly equal size, and they're trying to watch a baseball game. But the person on the left, the first two, that equal size box works for them, and they're able to see the game. But the person to the far right of shorter stature cannot see it. Equal won't work for them. Equity has always been built on into ADA. It's not this new buzzword. I know we're all talking about equity for all types of things now, which is wonderful. I'm not downplaying it at all. That is a beautiful goal. But I just want to stress that equity is the intent of the ADA. Equality is not the intent, it's equity. That people would have equitable access to our programs, our services, our activities, our employment opportunities. And even when they become employees, that they would have equity in being able to do the essential functions of their job. What that might mean, like you see here on this person, again, to the far right, instead of one box, they have two boxes. Now they can see the game. The person in the middle still only has that one box, but the person to the left doesn't need a reasonable accommodation. They can see it. And the statute It only applies. We only have to accommodate people that really have a real disability, as we talked about, and that first prong or the second prong of eligibility. Equity is the goal. So yeah, a person with disability might get something or a tool or device or some change in the work environment, etc., that is different from other employees. It may be necessary in order for them to have the equity that is designed within the ADA. So we want to think in terms of that. That's what we're trying to do. We may have to tweak a policy or a procedure in order to provide that equity for our employee. So what are the exceptions to reasonable accommodation? So I mentioned, if it's not reasonable, but here are the two hard things written into the law that we should think in terms of two acceptable reasons. Our employer can say no. And that is if it's an undue hardship, which deals with either a financial or an administrative burden that we'll talk about in a moment, or a direct threat to self or others. Now we're looking at that and saying, what in the world does an undue hardship and what is a direct threat? So let's talk about it. An undue hardship. It is an action that requires significant difficulty or expense in relation to the size of the employer, the resources available, and the nature of the operation. It includes any action that it is unduly costly, extensive, substantial, disruptive, or would fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business. So I'm just going to put this in real simple terms. It's difficult to do because it's costly or an administrative hardship as defined by the law. We're going to have a training just on undue hardship because we need to really get into a deep dive on what those triggers are for the employee. But for this, we just want you to be aware of it. I have to tell you, though, for a state entity like ourselves, it is very hard to try to say we're not doing it because it's an undue hardship. I get the question sometimes is, especially when we're like the memo that was recently done. There's a frequently asked question, who's going to pay for this stuff? So if somebody needs this or that, who's going to pay for it? The answer is your agency is going to pay for it. There is no, the ADA is an unfunded mandate. The expectation is we will find the dollars in order to accommodate someone. There is no money to help us to do that. There's nothing that exists at this point in time that would help us. So as we think about the funds that we receive as an agency, we need to think about, well, what if someone did ask for a reasonable accommodation? Do we have a fund for that? Do we have a budget for that? It is an unfunded mandate. So I'm just going to digress a little bit. That's why we have like these databases that we're creating, so you can get good data planning around budgeting for these things. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But just know that for an undue hardship, it's very difficult for a state or local government entity to say that, because the ADA will look at all the monies that you get, not just your size. So it looks at really the whole state, so to speak. What is a direct threat? When there is a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual employee with a disability or others. So the very important thing to note about this is that we cannot say something is a direct threat, because this is what happens a lot of time. I'm the boss, I'm a bigger manager than you, and I think it's a direct threat, so therefore we're not going to do it. It's not defined by opinion lacking evidence or simply organizational rank. That's what gets folks into trouble through a complaint situation when that's the way the decision was made. So I just want to give you an example of what could constitute a direct threat. First of all, know that it's on a case-by-case basis. So when I give this definition, when I give this example, we would still need to look at this example. No one should look at this example and say, well, he said this, and therefore that would be a direct threat. This is simply for example purposes. We'd have to examine that within our ADA process. Does it fit this definition of direct threat? But for an example, an employee with a contagious disease might pose a direct threat in a food handling position. And an employee whose medication for a disability causes drowsiness might be a direct threat in a position that requires driving. But well, I want to drive home. It all depends on the facts about the employee's condition and the demands of the employee's position. Well, these are just two examples. I could, really spend a whole day about direct threat as well. But again, that's not the purpose of this presentation. So we know that undue hardship and direct threat are the two reasons why we could potentially say no to reasonable accommodation request. And I'm just going to briefly talk about having an effective RA process. But I think it's important, if we are an employee out here, we want you to know that what we're promoting and encouraging agencies to do when it comes to their RA process, meaning reasonable accommodation process. Um, the RA request can be made in writing, face to face, or using any other method of communication. So if you need a reasonable accommodation, maybe your employee has a form or a document they want you to complete, and yes, you should do that. But let's say you don't, and the person makes you aware of that, we would take that information and we would make sure that we were responsive to whatever the request was. Something else that we want to make sure that we're doing is called the interactive process. I love that process because it requires us to discuss the RA with the employees, make them a part of it. I always like to look at that saying, taxation without representation is one of the reasons why we had the American Revolution. You have no representation on something you're going to dictate over me. I want representation. This interactive process helps the employee to be involved in that process. I get to talk to the employer and tell them why I need this, why I think this would be effective for me. Now, the employer, after having that conversation, can consider, do I need more medical, or is there other information required? What exactly do we need to do to continue to process this request? And then they'll evaluate it. Do I have the appropriate medical information? Sometimes employees want to know, do I have to provide medical? Well, that's how the way they validate your condition. Remember we said the two prongs? You have documentation that you have some kind of disability. Well, yes, your employer would need to see that to validate your eligibility. And if you don't have it, it is completely permissible for them to ask for you to complete some kind of medical form with your medical provider to see if you are, in fact, an individual with a disability as defined under the ADA. So you provide that, they'll see if they have the information, they'll start evaluating your request, they'll move on to making a decision. Again, they will let you know, this is where we're leaning, this is what we think will work based on that. Now, I have seen this and what I mean by that, reaching back out to the employee and say, hey, we have something maybe different that we like to offer that we think is effective. Sometimes employees are like, oh man, I didn't even think about that. That's fantastic. And sometimes it doesn't turn out that way. But how come you're not giving me the other thing? Because I really feel like I need this. So when we're making that decision and effective alternatives, we just want to make sure that we're really discussing accommodating that person effectively, so we can avoid not accommodating them and any kind of complaint process. And we do expect you to receive that information in writing, your approval or denial, what that means. So let's talk a little bit about best practices here. What are our ADA compliance best practices? Develop, train, and invest in your ADA coordinator. Your ADA coordinator is one of the critical pieces to making our ADA compliance and disability inclusion initiatives a reality. We are going to continue to provide training here at the Disability Inclusion Program. Some wonderful training, even to the point where you'll learn soon of our certification program. But we also encourage you to get the same type of certification that I have. So more information on that will be coming out soon. But training our ADA coordinators to really understand these processes under Title I and our obligations under Title II, so they can guide that education throughout our agency. Because the second thing we want to do is educate all staff regularly on the ADA and disability inclusion. I want to give an example of what we did when I was ADA coordinator at my previous agency, we regularly educated people on the ADA, the disability inclusion. Anytime we updated things, we would make sure that our employees understood what those updates were to our processes. And we would regularly evaluate maybe where we needed to provide more training to our management team. Something new has come up, or based on the kind of complaints that we receive, what do we need to educate our staff regularly on? And last but not least, our employees need to know what our process is. How do they ask for a reasonable accommodation? What kind of medical forms are you going to ask them to do and why? How quickly are you going to get back to them when they make a request? What is the basis of you saying yes or no? When our employees understand that, the process goes so much smoother when they make a request. That's my professional opinion. And our last best practice is when we think compliance and inclusion. It will help us to become that model employer that we want. We really want people with disabilities to want to work for the state. We want them to think that we're a model employer. We want them to feel like, hey, you know what? You work for the state and you need a reasonable accommodation to be effective in your job, to do those essential functions. They have a good process. They take care of their employees. It's so important to them they created a statewide position to help us with these efforts. That's what we want our employees to say. We want them to spread the word to maybe other people that have disabilities. Just a quick story. Again, in a previous role I had, worked with an employer who was a customer service company. And you probably know customer service companies have, they answer the phone. People are on the phone all the time. They have a lot of turnover. This company had a tremendous amount of turnover, and they came to us as an agency and said, "Hey, we need some help. We need to hire some people who will stay, because what's happening is we're training them, and as fast as we train them, they're out the door." That costs employers money and time. So, long story short, they started hiring some of the candidates that we had that had disabilities, and there was something that they noticed. It's something that they promoted themselves, is that the people with disabilities tended to stay longer and it was way less turnover. There was 10% turnover with people with disabilities. There was 60% turnover with people without disabilities. They said that providing reasonable accommodation was a no-brainer. It was cheaper to do that than to continue this cycle of losing people. The other benefit that they had is that these individuals went to go and tell other people with disabilities, this is a really cool place to work. And they started growing their workforce of people with disabilities. So I hope that that's something that could happen at the state level as well, because we really do a good job with this. Wow, we're at the question stage. And I know there may be some questions in the chat. And Chelsea is going to open up that door and ask any questions that are coming to the chat. If you're thinking about some questions now, you can put them in there. I know we're ending before this training was designed to end, but really the length of this training is going to depend on your questions. So, Chelsea, what questions do we have?
So right now there are no questions in the chat. We did get a request to put the slide deck, and I will put that in as soon as we're done here. I guess one thing to mention, if you have a question and you don't want to put it in the chat, you can feel free to message me privately and I will anonymously ask your question, or you can email me, just, send it to me and we'll get your questions answered. But one thing I think we might want to talk about a little more is, can you go into undue hardship and explain that in a little more detail?
Sure. So just a quick note on that. An employer, when it comes to undue hardship, remember we talked about it being something that was difficult to do, either financially or administratively. So an employer is not required to make an accommodation if it imposes that undue hardship. It is determined on a case-by-case basis. It is a part of the larger entity. So when it's looking at your funding structure, it's looking at the entire structure of your organization, not just your individual entity. It looks at the largest structure that it can, meaning as a state, we have a lot of money that's allocated to the state. So this type of saying no is typically for smaller employers that are private employers, not for state agencies. But again, we'll have a training on that undue hardship. One thing to note on that, if we do think something's an undue hardship, the employer must try to identify another accommodation that would not pose such a hardship. So it's not I get to get out of accommodating a person. We just may have to think about another option that could accommodate that individual. Anything else, Chelsea?
Yeah, so we've got a question here from Helen. How often does an accommodation form need to be completed / updated? Her doctor says some companies they deal with required every 3 months, but her agency says that it just needs to be updated yearly.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting question, because in my mind, if there is no change in the condition, if when you present the medical documentation rather, and it puts a time limit or a time when the physical impairment or mental impairment. So, and I'll give you an example. Let's say on there, they say for the next 12 months, this individual is impacted in these particular areas. So they're saying you are a person with a disability, either physical or mental impairment. But in 12 months, that might look different. Then in 12 months, that would trigger me to see what the changes were, if any. But outside of that, if it's a permanent condition, I would not ask for medical documentation to keep asking. I mean, for what? You have a permanent condition, then you should be fine. Now, if you have some change in your need of a reasonable accommodation, you would request that of your employer. But if I've already provided you a reasonable accommodation and I am satisfied with the medical and it's something that's permanent, then I'm not going to keep asking you 3 months, 6 months, or annually to update that. It would only be based on what the medical documentation says. So again, if it put a time limit, this is for the next 18 months, my client, my patient will need these things. Then in 18 months, I'm going to go back and see if there's anything different. So hopefully that answered your question, but yeah, that's pretty different. So no, I don't think it's the best practice to keep asking you for something unless there's a need for it based on that type of scenario I just gave you.
Okay, a question from Nick. Is it okay to suggest alternatives to services? For example, they offer an hour-long live webinar for training. If someone has a request for a transcription service for one of those live webinars, can they suggest that they use another more accessible resource, such as their hour-long e-course on the same topic?
Well, that depends. If they do the hour-long e-course, will it meet that person's needs? So the simple answer is, if you ask them, hey, we have an hour-long e-course on this topic, and these are the reasons why we think it will meet your accessibility needs. Will that work for you? And they say, yes, you're good to go. But if they say, well, no, I don't think that'll meet my needs, or they say, I want to be in the live session because I have questions. How would you handle that? So let's say, give you that same scenario. We have this recorded session. This is what we think it would meet your needs. And I'll be available after that. We have a 15-minute Q&A that we offered in the other session, the live session, and we'll be available to answer your questions at the conclusion of you looking at the recording. And then you can work that out with them, how they could get their questions answered. They probably will say, that's fine. But you have to have those kind of conversations. You can't just say, I mean, in my opinion, based on what I just heard, we'll just go ahead and take the webinar, because I don't even know how you would know if that would meet their needs or not. I don't know what the disability is. I don't know what they're asking for, but so just based on that question, that would be my answer.
Okay, I think, Bobby, this looks like a suggestion to me, Bobby, so jump in if you want. It says, might there be an annual certification that the accommodation might need to be updated, to give the ADA coordinator an opportunity to check and see if something else is needed?
Um, so if I understand the question correctly,
Yeah, not so much a
we,
question. That was just in reference to the previous question about not doing it at a certain cadence, like every 3 months, 6 months, which I get depending upon the situation might be too soon, but I could see perhaps an annual certification, maybe just that things hadn't changed, the progress or the condition hadn't progressed, something was additional wasn't needed.
yeah, okay. And the way you're putting it like that is pretty nice. I will say that in my mind, if we're educating our employees and letting them know how to request a reasonable accommodation, and that if your circumstances or situations change, just let us know. That to me is sufficient. I would say to train in lieu of sending something like that out. To, say, hey, is everything the same? I can't necessarily say that's a violation, but I will say that the ADA does say that we want to limit medical inquiries when there's no need for it. So in this case, it's almost like we're fishing and say, hey, do you need anything else? Again, I can't say that that is a violation, but I would say that I would replace that by annual education. This is, how we handle reasonable accommodation. And you may have one now. However, if your circumstance or situation changes, this is how you would contact us to, again, ask for reasonable accommodation. I would replace that through an educational process. That's what I would recommend as a best practice.
And I think, Eric has a question here that kind of is a segue. Do HIPAA laws affect the privacy issues as employers attempt to meet requests?
As far as keeping the medical information private, the ADA in and of itself says we have to do that, and that we are not allowed to share that with individuals who do not have the right to know. So let me just explain what that means, individuals that have the right to know. So let's say I am the ADA coordinator, and I get a request where someone needs a screen reading software for their computer. And in order to uh, provide that, I'm going to have to procure it. So I may have to go through an internal process to procure it and say, this is going to be assigned to so-and-so as a reasonable accommodation. I'm not going to give them medical when by saying that it's by reasonable accommodation, they're going to know it's ADA related. But they have a right to know because you have to follow your process for a procurement. That could also be the case for the IT person who has to install it, and maybe provide some basic training on, hey, we're going to install this and this is how you would use that. We may have to even hire someone on the outside to give training depending on what it was and the person's condition and their need, etc. But so the right to know is people would help us to procure it or provide it. But best practice, and all you ADA coordinators know that I say this all the time, the medical information, there's no need to share it. You just say you're the one that makes the decision. You and whoever else is a member of your team that looks at the medical and makes those eligibility decisions. And once you make that decision, there's no need to share it with anyone. You can share the limitation needs. And so we're providing this because, they need this for access, but there's no need to ever, in my mind, I would strongly suggest that you don't share the medical with anyone else on the team. No one has that right to know, except maybe your supervisor or other people by your agency will help with that RA process, decision-making process.
Okay, we have a question from Denise. The process that they have in place asks that employees who have disabilities that are not visible or obvious, for example, diabetic retinopathy, back problems, etc., provide medical documentation with the application. Since she has become ADA coordinator in the fall of 2021, at least 5 employees have requested an accommodation but have not completed the application with a doctor's note. After a period of time, should the coordinator reach out to the employees or consider the application process incomplete until the employee files the application?
So I am confused about what they mean by application process. Um, are they talking about applying for a reasonable accommodation, or are they talking about applying for employment? Maybe they can just clarify that for me. So I can answer from both angles.
Did you
But
want
if
to
we're-
jump in, Denise?
You can just unmute yourself, Denise, if you like. So I can answer that from both angles. If we're talking about the application process or someone applying for a job, we cannot ask them to do that in the application process. If that is what you meant, then that really should stop. We can't ask people to divulge any type of disability in the application process. That is up to them if they want to tell us, and they only have to tell us if they need a reasonable accommodation.
I think she clarified here. She's referring to employees who are applying for a reasonable accommodation.
Okay, good. Okay. All right. Very good. So to answer that part, yeah, they have to complete the medical. If they do not provide you with some documentation where you can authenticate it, that they are eligible, either of those first two prongs that I talked about, then I'll just, and I think your question was, what should we do? Yeah, I would reach back out to them and say, first of all, I give them, in our process, we let them know they had 30 days to do it. Now, I do want to caution, that was just what we put in the policy. A person really, maybe, they may not really give it to us for 60 days. But you also are required to accommodate them because you don't have what you need. You don't even know if they're eligible. You don't even know if they meet eligibility. So I would write them back and say, in order to consider your reasonable accommodation request, we need you to provide us with medical documentation or complete this form, which I think you said. And then I would give them a date. If you do not, complete this within 30 days, we will close your reasonable accommodation request. However, you can reopen the request at any time and provide the documentation to support your request, because they can. So closing out a request does not close out that person turning around and then giving you what you need. So I would just caution one other thing with that answer. If you have a particular case or something that's happening, you just want to run it by me, feel free to do that to make sure I have all the details. So I'm just kind of answering that question based on how it was presented. But yes, I would write them back. I would tell them again what I needed. I would tell them by when I needed it. I would tell them that if they don't do it, then we'll close out the request. And lastly, I would open up the door. However, you at any time can reopen this request and provide the medical, and we will proceed with processing your request. And that is if you need the medical to do it. And that's what you mentioned. You said it was invisible. You really don't know. You don't have any other documentation to authenticate it. So yeah, you have every right to ask for that if that's the fact pattern.
Okay, I think not really a question, but a statement from Jennifer. Her agency is returning to work this week. Some employees are not happy with returning, so they are applying for accommodations. Do you have any comments on that, James?
Yes, that is so popular. That's why we're doing COVID-19 and return to work in April. We'll send that out soon. But in the interim, you can't wait till April. What a lot of agencies are doing, they're just reaching out. I'm having meetings about that quite a bit. And so feel free to reach out. You'll have your one-to-one. You can run some of those cases by me, what they're requesting, and I will give you some consultation on what my thoughts are on how to do that. And I'll just give you an example. I'm not going to give you an example of any particular case, but if I were to give a percentage of people coming to me, and do they have to do something from home, or based on the fact pattern they present me, do they not have to do it? I don't make the ADA decision, but I provide you with consultation and guidance. And I would say about 75% of the time, I've asked them just quite simply, well, why can't you let them work from home? Based on that fact pattern, based on what the doctor is saying, based on what their condition is, based on what the concern is. Uh, you tell me, why can't you do it? 75% of the time, I agree that maybe they should not be coming back into the office. But there is 25% of the time. I just had a conversation with someone the other day. Well, the way she broke it down and her due diligence, um, she was on top of it. And I did agree with her. The steps she was taking were completely appropriate. And I'm curious to see how that all turns out. So she's on, she knows who she is. But I'll be curious to see how that all turns out. But she was right. She presented the facts. Um, I did not agree that in those cases, those people should be working from home based on what they presented in the medical documentation. So long story short, feel free to reach out. I will give you an honest opinion, but the accommodation decision rests with you and your agency.
Yeah, I don't see any more questions. Carolina did say, she mentioned that they still must have a disability under the ADA. So I think and I think you said that, James, but it's important to emphasize that, even if it's COVID related, they must qualify for a disability under the ADA.
That is correct. In every instance where we provide reasonable accommodation, you want to go through that process that I outlined. And the very first thing is, are they a person with a disability or not? Because if at the end of the day, similar to the person who asked the question about, hey, if they're not filling out these forms and you have no other way to authenticate their condition, well, you don't know if they're a person with a reasonable, if they're eligible under the ADA. So you're not under any obligation to accommodate them if that's what your fact pattern is. So yeah, she's absolutely right. They have to have an ADA, a disability under the ADA, and they have to establish why they need to have this accommodation, based on what their condition is. So it's not just having any kind of disability. It's this disability impacts these major life activities or major bodily functions. This is why working in the office would provide a issue for me. And again, that's delineated in the medical that is provided. Any other questions?
It looks like there are no more questions. I earlier, someone had asked if we can put the slide deck in the chat, and I am attempting to do that. I don't know if it's going to upload, so if I can't get it into the chat, I will email it out to everyone that's on here. And I did put the learner guide on at the beginning, and I'll do it again here as soon as the PowerPoint decides whether or not it's going to upload. So.
Okay. No, that's excellent. Thank you, Chelsea. So you'll get it either through the chat, and I think as a best practice, we will just email those things out to everybody who's on here, so you don't have to, the chat closes out after a while. So we'll make sure you get that via email following this presentation. Excellent questions. I know this process sometimes can be confusing and sometimes like we're chasing our tail, so to speak. But I do, again, and want to invite you, and I used to say this and a few people would come to me and ask me questions. Now it's a much broader spectrum that come and that maybe ask some specific questions. And you'll see that I invite you to do it. Very reasonable. I want to help you as well as the employee. And I want to make sure that we're in compliance on also promoting disability inclusion. But sometimes, to be very honest, some of the reasons why we don't want to do it are legitimate. So feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to work with you and at least provide you with some consultation and guidance. So with that being said, if there are no other questions, excellent audience today. Thank you for the questions that you did do. We'll be announcing some more training sessions. And then our practice is going to be as we provide some of these trainings, especially on Title I, Title II, the reasonable accommodation process. We're going to offer a workshop afterwards, meaning you can bring your issues and your questions to those workshops versus trying to just do it in the training. This was a basic overview of the ADA. I hope it was informative for the audience and provided you some history as well as some obligations that we have under Title I and Title II. But again, those deeper dives are going to be in subsequent trainings. Thank you so much from the State of Ohio Disability Inclusion Program. We appreciate your attendance today. And again, we invite you to reach out to us if you have any additional questions or you need a consultation. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.